For my project today, I wanted to discuss the connection between mental health and microbiology, and basically how the health of our gut can affect our brain and our behavior. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about are going to be experiments that have been done to prove that the health of our stomach can have an effect on our brain, and the actual physical connection between our stomachs and our brains and how our stomachs can change our behavior. So the first term I wanted to talk about is called microbiota dysbiosis, and dysbiosis is basically just defined as an imbalance in the microflora of our stomach. There's a couple different things that can cause this, but basically when this happens, it can cause physical changes in the body, and it can also change our behavior, including our social behavior. So Healthline.com posted this, and it's just a list of a couple of things that can change the microbiota of our stomach and cause an imbalance. So some of the more important ones that I noticed were the dietary changes. So if you're intaking more protein or sugar or food additives, it's hard for your body to process, and it will change your metabolism and change the way that your stomach is chemically made up. Another thing could be an accidental chemical consumption. This is something I'm interested in with makeup products. So if you're always putting makeup products on your face and those chemicals aren't regulated to be ingested, but you're constantly ingesting your lipstick all day, I think that could possibly be a reasoning for changing the microbiota of your stomach. Then they also talked about how chemicals from pesticides on unwashed fruit can change your stomach biota. Drinking alcoholic beverages can change your biota. New medications, we know that antibiotics have lots of different side effects like nausea and diarrhea and other things. So taking any kind of antibiotic is probably going to change the way that you're digesting your food. Poor dental hygiene was a cool one that I had never thought about. Also, stress and anxiety. This is interesting because what I'm talking about is mental health and how the stomach affects the brain, and then this flips it back to how the brain affects the stomach. So it's like a two-way street of just nonsense. Also, unprotected sex can introduce you to new bacteria that can cause changes in your body. So how does this relate back to mental health? There's papers that have done studies finding that irritable bowel syndrome is comorbid with a lot of psychiatric disorders such as anxiety and depression. There's other studies indicating that behavioral patterns and choices can reflect our microflora. So the microflora can cause changes in your body like mood disorders or anxiety. And one of the studies that I wanted to discuss was these studies that were done with mice and restraints. So basically, the scientists would restrain mice with different levels of microflora in their stomachs and see how they would react to these stressful situations. So the mice were restrained and they had unhealthy microbiota and the scientists saw an increase in the stress hormone corticosteroid and a decrease in proteins that stimulate neurogenesis. So the mice were overproducing stress hormones, showing that they were stressed out, and they weren't having as much of this hormone that's producing neurogenesis, so they're not learning as much, or their neurons aren't regenerating as much. What's interesting is that they reintroduced the healthy organisms into the mice, and I listed the bacteria there that they introduced. And this caused a restoration of the deficits of corticosteroid, and it also showed that the mice were having more neurogenesis after being reintroduced to this bacteria. So the next thing I want to talk about that's the most interesting to me is how the stomach is actually connected to the brain. And so this connection is called the gut-brain axis, and it's basically the connection between the enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system in your stomach, that has your stomach, your small intestine, everything in the gastrointestinal tract, and how it's connected to your central nervous system, so your brainstem or your spinal cord and your brainstem and your brain. And these two are connected through the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve runs from your stomach through your heart to your brain. And I actually have the picture of it here. So this is the vagus nerve shown in the picture. And basically the way that the vagus nerve connects or sends signals from the stomach to the brain is in the small intestine. The small intestine the walls of the small intestine is covered with a velvety substance that has these cells on them. And a lot of the cells on the walls are enterocyte cells or goblet cells, which are just normal stomach cells. And then there's also these important cells dotted within that are called enteroendocrine cells or neuropod cells. And this is how those signals are sent from the stomach back up to the brain. So these cells communicate through hormones and also, they communicate through hormones, but what is the cell is connected to an afferent nerve or an afferent neuron in the stomach that runs from the stomach to the brain. And afferent just means like a sensory neuron. And so these neuropod cells can sense and react to mechanical, thermal, and chemical signals. And so they detect these signals and then they electrically send them through the neuron to the brain to change the brain behavior. So this is how the bacteria signals to the brain, but it could also be a portal for access to pathogens into the brain. As long as pathogens can break the blood-brain barrier, then they can be sent from the stomach to the brain. And so one of the last things I wanted to talk about is what this means for treatments of mental disorders. So a couple of studies have been done with mice showing that when they are treated with probiotics, they show less stress in the electric shock experiment or less anxiety. So the probiotics are actually decreasing anxiety within the mice. And there was another study found with humans where after humans were treated with probiotics for a certain amount of time, they rated having higher moods after a while. So the probiotics were actually helping to treat their anxiety or their depression and actually improve their moods. So this is just a little bit of evidence that the way that our stomachs are composed can have an effect on our brain and in turn have an effect on our behavior.